The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Nearshoring, foreshoring, and onshoring are terms that are becoming common in reference to moves within the United States to address a number of issues associated with global value chains. According to co-author Laura Alfaro of a paper that was prepared for the Jackson Hole Symposium in 2023, there is a looming great relocation on the horizon. Alfaro says the evidence is clear. The U.S. reliance on China peaked in 2017. The introduction of tariffs by President Trump and continued application of those tariffs by President Biden, as well as the ongoing power play between the two countries, has brought about changes to distribution channels. According to Alfaro, Vietnam and Mexico have and continue to rise in prominence as preferred trading partners with the U.S., and while Canada has slipped over the past 30 years, it still remains a strong trading partner. I invited Laura Alfaro of the Harvard Business School to join me for a conversation that matters about the shifting trade patterns and relationships that are underway. Professor Alfaro, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
You co-authored this paper and presentation to Jackson Hole Summit last month. When you started to prepare it, were you surprised by what you started to see as evidence that suggested that there is some decoupling between the United States and China?
So, again, thank you for the opportunity to share our findings. We were not fully surprised of all results because there is evidence in other work that has documented these patterns, and we hear them a lot when talking to students, participants. I tend to teach a lot of executives, so there is a lot of discussion about these changes. Perhaps what was more interesting was and surprising was the quantities, how deep this reallocation has been. One issue we do want to clarify, and is perhaps our opening comment in the paper, is there is a lot of talk of deglobalization, and that is not what we're seeing. The US has never seen the level of imports it has seen. It is more this reallocation. As you mentioned, a lot is to Asia, Vietnam, what we call high-income Asian countries, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, lower-income Asian countries, India, but it's a lot within NAFTA, and that is Mexico and Canada. And we do emphasize this result because both Canada and Mexico have already very high levels of trade with the US, which is not the case as Vietnam, and so there was even more trade in these two countries are friends, but they're also near. So a deepening, if you want, of the NAFTA relation in the US.
So is this a shift by American companies that had been located in China, where they had made their foreign direct investments, built their factories out, and have now started to say, China is posing problems for us, we think that we need to diversify? Is that what's happening, or is there just a straight move by importers in the United States to say, I want to find a different supplier in a different jurisdiction?
So we document that a lot of it is trade. And in terms of FDI, is more like, I'm not going to go, much more than I'm going to get out. And that I'm not going to go has been happening even before the Trump tariffs. In trade also, it has happened before the Trump tariffs, but it's clear that the Trump tariffs, the 217 tariffs, intensified this trend. As I said, it was happening because China has developed, and development, as we all know, is to pay higher wages. And so firms, both in trade or FDI, have tried to look for other locations. So there is a pre-trend. You do see they're trying to go to, again, lower cost countries. But after the tariffs, and as you mentioned in your introduction, the fact that Biden didn't get rid of the tariffs, but also had additional policies, many firms that were like, let me see what's going on, are just now in like, no, I know what's going on. This is here to stay. And so some actively have looked for additional trade partners, diversifying trade, and some actively have opened affiliates in some other countries. Many have kept their relations with China, again, but it's my additional firm or my additional supplier, I'm just going to go somewhere else. And that is what we document, which again, to your first question, was that surprising? Quantitatively, it was surprising. It is the products that have lost market share in China that we see them gaining market share in some other, in the countries that we have mentioned.
What kinds of products are you referring to?
And so in the paper we document, we use a measure that is upstreamness, that is a summary statistic and measure created by my co-author. When a product is very downstream, it's a product that is very close to the final consumer. So think toys, clothing, even washers and dryers. They're usually bought by the final consumer. We see a lot of that reallocating from China to Vietnam. Why? Low cost. And also some of the network of suppliers are starting to go there. But we also see more upstream, think petrochemicals, the pieces of semiconductors. We see a lot of reallocation of those products. Semiconductors, we saw a 10% drop in the market share of China. And so those and also parts of electronics are going to Vietnam, but also a lot to Mexico. And so Mexico is very interesting how it's a very now deep relation with the US in many products. Again, a lot of these very upstream relative to downstream products that are going more to Vietnam. Canada is a little bit in between, a lot of upstream products, but the relation Canada-US has always been a little bit more upstream than downstream. Again, related to costs.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So there's a myriad of reasons why it's shifting. Is cost the number one driving force, or are there other geopolitical forces at work that companies are saying we need to mitigate risk, and so therefore we need to diversify our supply chains?
As I said, there was a trend associated with costs, but our results suggest it is policy. So again, this is perhaps a more technical, but controlling for tariffs and some other policies, that seems to be one of the main variables explaining that shift to Vietnam, to Mexico, to these other countries. And the policies, the tariffs, behind them, there are different motivations, but a lot have been strategic. So it is a response to active policy by governments.
Is the power play between the United States and China also an influencing factor? And I sort of bring that up a little bit in relationship to what has happened in Canada. I'm not sure that you're aware of the fact that there were two business executives that were seized by the Chinese government. We call it the case of the two Michaels. And it's put a real chill on top executives for companies from Canada and their willingness to travel to China. Has that had a spillover impact on other nations, and in particular the United States, having witnessed that?
So at that micro level, my estimates cannot speak. I understand that's a very academic response, but I think what's behind the policy, it is events like that. And so the tariffs were put in 2017. The Biden administration didn't get rid of them. If anything, the policy has intensified. And behind that more intense, if you want, concerns are events like this. But again, it's more generally geopolitics, strategic considerations, national defense. Semiconductors is one of the main sectors being targeted, and there is all of these concerns. But But again, I cannot deny these type of events are not behind the reason why the government has created this policy that is here to stay. So one thing we say in our paper, doesn't matter who's going to win the US election, these policies are not going to go away. And that certainty is what's driving firms also to change. These policies are here to stay because this is a government concern that is beyond the next election cycle. And why is this a concern beyond the next election cycle? It is because strategic considerations, national defense, they take the intellectual property, but also human rights. If you go there, you don't know what will happen. Again, all of this bundle goes behind this policy. I also have this very nice survey that I'm doing with my co-author David Chor and also Maggie Chen, that we have been surveying US participants for the last 5 years, trying to find ways to change US people's views on trade, because in the US, there's a very negative view on trade. 60% of the population has turned against trade. This didn't used to be the case 10 years ago. This didn't used to be the case with NAFTA. And what we found out, that is a deep concern about the relation with China and the relation with China in respect to potential jobs. So it is people's sentiment fed with all of these events that they find out from the news. But again, things that perhaps they have seen in their towns. And so politicians see this also in the public. And a combination of all of these means, again, these policies are here to stay. Firms went over the wait and see period, and now they're actively mentioning, I'm going to start this firm somewhere else, I'm going to move this plant, I'm going to find this different supply.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So you, in your paper, make a point of suggesting that this is not a complete decoupling from China, because Chinese organizations or the Chinese government are also making foreign direct investments into Vietnam and Mexico and so on. And so it's, yes, much of this trade is moving geographically, but ultimately the link may be back to China. Is this something that means that what we think we're witnessing might be a little different than it appears on the surface?
So the direct linkages, US, China, they're clearly, as you said, since 2017, they peaked. In the paper, we compare a lot with the case of Japan. So Japan in the 60s and 70s, as the US started to have bilateral trade deficits, also started a policy of tariffs, concerns of national security, also related to semiconductors. Japan at that time responded with voluntary restrictions on cars, but they also started an active policy of moving affiliates to the US. And the scope and the speed in which Japanese firms came to the US is dramatic. And we document that in the case and in the paper. And we mentioned that if one only looks at that direct relation via imports, US-Japan is 5% of market share. If one goes and compares the sales of foreign affiliates and adds the sales via imports, Japan is actually one of the main partners, and it triples. We make the point that the US is not going to allow China to do that. Again, geopolitics in the US. But what China is doing is replicating via friends. So it is going to Vietnam, it is going to Mexico from a very low base, but it's also intensifying trade with friends. And so we document that of the main top 5 trading partners of the US, every single one of them, except Japan, has seen an increase in the Chinese market share in the last 5 years. So directly, the US is diminishing via direct links, FDI, and trade. China is not going to replicate by FDI in the US, but it is indirectly maintaining the relation via imports to other countries and FDI to other countries. So it is likely that any input that US buys from another country has a similar share of Chinese ownership as it used to be 5 years ago. Is that the same? Probably not. You do perhaps are diminishing a little bit of risk by not having directly, but we do caution that it is not 100% independence, especially if France are increasing the relation with China.
There are benefits to countries like Vietnam and Mexico in particular if there is this move towards, even with FDIs from China into those two countries, there's the creation of jobs, there's an increase in GDP and per capita GDP. So we're spreading around reliance and we're spreading out risk across a greater number of supply chains. That's the way it appears to me.
That is possible, and it is the case that one sees a lot of economic activity in the US, which, by the way, is not only coming from China. The US is also opening up shops in Mexico. The Europeans are opening up shops in Mexico, especially everything related to cars and auto parts. But one can argue that one can also generate jobs through direct trade. And so it becomes a question which one of the two modes of engagement creates more opportunities and more jobs. But there is no doubt that Mexico is having a lot of economic activity related to that. In fact, there is this concern that the exchange rate is appreciating a lot.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. You know, one of the benefits, of course, globalization, and it touches on a point that you made earlier, is that there would be lower costs to companies and therefore ultimately consumers. And so that lower cost was one of the driving forces for companies to say, well, we're going to move to supply chains that are outside of China. But if we take a look at what's going on right now based on your presentation, what is the impact on inflation? Because this has been a very big point within the United States and Canada in trying to maintain or keep a lid on inflation. Will these shifts have a positive or a more costly impact on inflation?
So in the short run, we document that it's going to have higher cost effects. Why? Firms were thinking about moving, but they were taking their time. They were looking at the cost benefits. All of a sudden, they're, if you want, forced to do this change faster than they wanted. So if you want any deviation, forced deviation from what would have been the natural decision of a firm, is costly. And we document that. Inputs that are now being brought from Vietnam that used to be brought from China are 10% more expensive than they used to be. It's a little bit less in Mexico, 3%. It's also 3% in Singapore and Korea. So there is an increase in the cost. There is, that doesn't necessarily mean it's inflation, because inflation is every period that see an increase in the prices, not necessarily just a one-off. But this is likely to impact the whole value chain. And again, 10% is not a small number. Yeah. And it's not a small number to the country that we were moving to, because it was supposed to be cheaper. So I, as a firm, would have moved to Vietnam if I can get lower costs. I am now moving and getting 10% higher than what I used to do in China. So this is going to be more costly, it's going to go the whole value chain. And since all of this takes time, we are going to see it as an increase in prices, which are going to feed into this view that inflation continues to be a cost. But in general, if globalization was correlated with lower prices, these abrupt changes to reallocate are going to be associated with higher costs. The impact on the overall inflation for consumers in the US is not 10% because the US continues to be a relatively closed economy. So in the US, what continues to matter are domestic prices. But firms are also setting shops in the US, and we document that, especially in semiconductors. And there is evidence that they cannot find enough workers, they cannot find enough specialized workers. There is evidence that the construction costs in the US are higher. So it is likely to impact consumer prices, for sure producer prices, and continue to make, if you want, the Fed's job a little bit tougher, and reduce the sensitivity of our traditional tools, interest rates, to lower inflation. Because again, the companies are getting pushed because of subsidies and tariffs, and that makes them less respondent to the traditional tools.
So over the last 15 years, from my perspective, when we looked at Asia Pacific, the heavy reliance was on this growing interdependence with China. As you indicated, Japan shifted its strategy and things moved. Going forward, when we think about Asia Pacific, do we need to now expand our thinking even to the Indo-Pacific to say that these links are now spreading out? Not minus China, but trading partnerships plus China, but not just China-centric.
So in the paper, we take a little bit of a longer perspective, perhaps not for me as much, because I'm now older, but we just started in the 90s to document this interesting fact that even when the US had the dramatic shift from Japan to China, and until a certain extent from Canada to Mexico, what is very interesting about the US is that the regional shares have remained incredibly constant. So the US for the last 30, 40 years has imported close to 20% from Europe, including UK. Sorry, Brexit, but I'm still putting them together. So 20% Europe, 30% NAFTA, 40% Asia. And so what has happened is a reallocation within countries in these groups. So in Europe, it was from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, in NAFTA from Canada to Mexico, and in Asia from Japan to China, and before Taiwan, Hong Kong. And now what we see is from China to Vietnam, India. So as regions, the US has been extremely stable. And so we make the point that in the US, it has been more regional value chains, more than global value chains, but indeed now it's spreading into more countries in Asia. What is a shame is that it has always been very little with Africa and remains very little with Africa. So perhaps that's the next frontier.
All of which indicates that there's always shifting sands here and that there is relocation underway, and it's very important to anybody who relies on what those global value chains are to pay attention to these changes that are underway right now or underfoot. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me.